So anyway, we're continuing, of course, talking about today the rise of Macedonia, of course, which I had, of course, I actually already started on it from the part three lecture, or at the end of part three lecture last time on Wednesday the other day. And I told you how the rise of Macedonia was this northern Greek state. It was a kingdom that formed, I think, sometime around the 4th century BC when it became powerful, which started out as a city-state, and then over time it, formed into, of course, a major kingdom called the Macedonian Kingdom, or Macedon, as they called it for short. And I think I went through and I talked about how one of its first great kings, of course, was King Philip of Macedon, sometimes called Philip II of Macedonia, also as well. He lived in the 4th century or mid-4th century BC. He was the one that was the father of Alexander the Great that it went into. And I believe I already talked about the military, how he developed the Macedonian military, its tactics, and all of that. Talked about his wife, Queen Olympias, and of course, she was the mother, of course, of Alexander the Great. I think we went into that already and talked about all that. Talked about how Philip took over Greece, and then how Philip got assassinated. That was the key thing, Philip got assassinated, of course, 336 BC. That led to Alexander the Great coming to power. So that's pretty much where we're at that point from the previous lecture. And Alexander was only 20 years old, of course, when he came in. So we're going to go ahead and talk about him first. So Alexander the Great, who, of course, you see in that picture that you're looking at. I think I've got some other pictures of him right here as well. We'll get to that in a second. But Alexander, of course, came to the throne. He was 20. He died very young. In fact, Alexander was only about 32 years old when he died. So he was only king for about almost 13 years. But of course, in that time, of course, Alexander does a lot of stuff. He conquers a good bit of the known world at the time. Let's talk about some of the information about Alexander. I'll kind of get into first and talk about a little bit of background about Alexander. Alexander was, like I said, the son of King Philip II of Macedon. Of course, his mother, I told you, was Queen Olympias, who's actually from Epirus, which is kind of west of Macedon, where I think would be Albania would be now today. I told you how he was tutored and educated by Aristotle. Aristotle came to Macedonia. He was originally from Macedonia, and he set up a school there to, of course, teach a lot of the nobility's children. And of course, he ended up, educating Aristotle. Aristotle ended up educating him. I think when he was in, I want to say middle school or high school age. And so he was heavily influenced by Aristotle, Alexander, overall. They also talk about how Alexander, when he was around 12 years old or so, he got this horse named Bucephalus. And it was a very wild horse that was originally a gift for his father. And of course, nobody could ride it. It would buck people off. And so his father was going to get rid of the horse. And so Alexander said, "Hey, I want to buy the horse." And they, of course, laughed at him. You'll never be able to ride it. And he took the horse. And what's interesting about the horse was he figured out why it was so skittish and wouldn't let people ride it. He found out that it was afraid of its own shadow. So he was able to figure out how to tame it. I think he figured out that if he turned the horse where it couldn't see its own shadow, he could ride it. They also talk about sometimes Alexander's, one of his best friends, whose name was Hephaestion, who he kind of grew up with, and they were educated by Aristotle together. They always tell a lot of stories about him and Hephaestion and all of that. And of course, there's always these modern stories they talk about sometimes that maybe they were lovers or something like that, because the Greeks were bisexual. Maybe, maybe not. They don't really know about that, but they do know that he was one of his best friends, like for a long time. I think when he died before him, he was kind of real sad about it. Let me also talk about the different sources that are out there about Alexander. Um, those are the four main sources that are the oldest that are written about Alexander. The one you see at the top, Diodorus of Sicily, is considered to be the oldest source ever written by Alexander. They think there were other books before that, but they don't exist anymore. So they're kind of don't exist, but these are the ones that are, when I say extent, they mean they still exist. And Diodorus of Sicily wrote that around the 1st century BC. It was part of a book he wrote called the Library of World History. It's in volume 8, but it's not considered that famous of a source. Plutarch is another one. Plutarch, of course, the life of Alexander. Plutarch wrote a series of biographies. He's a Greek writer called the Parallel Lives. And these compare like Greek figures with Roman figures. And of course, Plutarch compared Alexander to Julius Caesar. Then they have Arian of Nicomedia, who I've kind of mentioned before, I believe. He's got a series of books called the Campaigns of Alexander, which is often called the Anabasis, is what they call it, or Anabasis. Should be Alexander there. And that's a famous one too. So they say those two are probably the most famous, and both were Greek writers. Then they have a Roman writer, Quintius Curtius Rufus, was also another writer. He wrote the history of Alexander the Great, written about 2,000 years ago or so. That one's considered also not bad as well as a source. So those are all the ones that are, of course, are well known, these sources that are right here. And they think there are other sources, and there's even these other sources, like the Alexander romance you may have heard of, that kind of make up a bunch of stories about him in medieval times. And there's a lot of stories about Alexander. They're not sure really true or not. So he's one of these figures that's kind of been somewhat romanticized a little bit. Right. Now, what happened after Alexander became king in 336, a bunch of the Greek city-states actually rebelled against him. And so he had to actually go down there and subdue them, including, I think, the city-state of Thebes is one of the main ones that he had to subdue. And he actually had to sack them at one point, sack the city of Thebes to basically, eliminate their power. And then from there, he was able to kind of control the Greeks more. And after that, he was able to get a lot of the Greeks, like Athens, etc., to form like an alliance with Alexander to fight against Persia. And so that became the thing that, Alexander would eventually do, which would go on to conquer and defeat the Persian Empire. It's his most famous feat, really, overall. And so he becomes famous for destroying what's later, referred to by the Greeks as the Achaemenid Empire, the first Persian Empire, which it was as well. At the time, the Persian Empire was led by a king named Darius III, or also pronounced Darius. And Darius III was the last Persian king. I think when this happened, he was only in his early 30s when he fought Alexander. And it's believed that Alexander invaded the Persian Empire sometime in what is the spring of 334 BC. Likely, I think the popular date is usually around May. There's a picture of Darius III. He only reigned about really 7 or 8 years on the throne. There's Alexander, of course, famous painting they found later, I think, at Pompeii. With him on his horse Bucephalus, which, by the way, Bucephalus means in Greek ox head, because he was kind of stubborn. Here's a map showing you, by the way, the route that Alexander took to conquer the Persian Empire, most of the Near East. You can see starting in Greece, went into Turkey, then he goes down to Egypt, and then you can see Iraq, Iran, all the way to pretty much the Indus River basin in India. So this whole trek, this Anabasis, I think, as Arian calls it, or something like that, would take something like about 10 years to conquer all this territory that you're looking at. And it first started in 334 when Alexander's forces, with maybe they think about, want to say 30, 40,000 or so troops, cross where the Hellespont is into Turkey. In what is like, they think, I said, May of 334, which is, by the way, they think not that far from where ancient Troy is. Alexander's forces fought against some of Darius's forces, which were mostly forces that were under some of their satraps that were in the west in Turkey. And his forces easily battered and defeated the Darius's little small army there at the Battle of the River Granicus. And that was considered one of the first battles, really, of the war. Smashed their forces, and then from there, he was able to basically march on and take part of like Turkey at that point. So he basically seizes Western Turkey. And at that point, in that map I was showing you a second ago, he marches down the coast of where Ionia is and frees all these Greek peoples that are up and down the coast here. And a lot of them join up with him at that point. Then his forces march eastward, through where Gordium is, and then down here where that X is, into eastern Turkey right here. Now, at that point, what happens next? Darius, realizing that it looks like Alexander is going to try to invade his empire, he decides to bring up forces at that point. And so it leads to a famous battle between the two sides. It's one of two battles, by the way, where Alexander the Great fights King Darius III at the Battle of Issus, which is located like in the southeastern part of Turkey, close to, not that far from the Syrian border. It's where it is. So both sides have these two armies that of course appear and fight each other. Sometime they think in November or at the end of November, or maybe sometime at the end of the year in 330 BC. That's when they think it happened. I've got a map showing you of some of the battlefields, of course, like Issus, which is right here. So there's the two battles where the two fought each other and faced off. It's kind of weird, but you can see they're actually facing opposite. You probably wonder why that is. Seems like it would be the other way, since Alexander is coming from the west. But apparently the two armies passed each other up. And so they had to turn around and attack each other. It's kind of stupid. But so there they are facing there. And one of the things that happened in the battle, which is interesting, was that the Persians weren't able to get enough cavalry in like they wanted, because there were some kind of mountains over here somewhere. They were kind of hemmed in. Darius had his cavalry over here, and then Alexander had his cavalry over here, and then his infantry in the middle. Parmenion, by the way, was one of his best generals, was in the battle here with his infantry. So the companion cavalry was over here. Well, in this battle, what happened was the companion cavalry, with some help of infantry, eventually broke through what is Darius's left flank. And when that happened, it caused basically a rout. It led to the collapse of what is really Darius's army, the Persian army. And of course, one of the things, if you know about what happened at the Battle of Issus, was that Darius fled the battle. He fled like in terror. He didn't want to get captured, I guess. And so he ran off. And so Alexander was able to capture pretty much his whole headquarters and all his like royal baggage and treasure and all that he had. I think he captured his mother and one of his daughters too, as well. So lopsided victory. And so with that, what happened, of course, because of the fact that Darius gets defeated there at that point, it causes the whole western part of basically Darius's empire to fall. So Alexander then marches into Syria, takes that, then goes southward, takes over Lebanon and what is where Israel was. And then he also takes over Egypt as well. So he goes at about 332, he's pretty much marching into Egypt at that point. And so see, at that point, you can see he's conquered like half of the empire at that point. Yeah, when he marches into Egypt, the Egyptians basically declare him Pharaoh of Egypt, which they weren't they weren't too, unhappy about it. The Egyptians really didn't really like the Egyptians didn't really like the Persians, and so they were kind of happy to have him in there instead. And at one point, Alexander was even declared part god. They said he was the son of Amun Ra, basically. So, and then, of course, if you know about it, they believe that Alexander stayed in Egypt about 10 months. Was how long he was there. I think between about 332 to about 331 BC. And while he was there, he began planning and he began constructing the city of Alexandria, which is, of course, on the Mediterranean coast there in northern Egypt. And, of course, everywhere Alexander went, if you know about it, he would basically build these Greek cities that were, most of them were named after him. If you know about it, I think he built like 12 or 13 cities named after him. And later, that's the one, of course, he gets buried in later, but they're not sure where his tomb is. They lost it in ancient times, and so it's buried somewhere below the old city of Alexandria, but nobody's been able to find it in modern times. Darius at that point wanted to seek peace with Alexander. So if you know what happened, he sent ambassadors to Alexander in Egypt saying, hey, I'd like to make peace with you and end the war we're fighting. And he offered Alexander basically part of his empire. Basically, I think he was going to give him his empire up to where the Euphrates River is, which would be in this map here about right here. So for basically everything from here, like Western Iraq, all the way to Egypt and Turkey, he could have that basically. He also told him, you can have one of my daughters in marriage. We'll marry each other, and and what happened was Alexander had a meeting with his generals to discuss if they should take this peace deal with the Persians. And of course, if you know the story about it, one of Alexander's generals spoke up. His name was Parmenion, who I mentioned before. And Parmenion said, if I was Alexander, I would take this peace offering. Of course, and if you know what happened famously, Alexander said about that, he said, if I was Parmenion, I would. So Alexander at that point, I think, realized that he could probably finish off, the rest of Darius's empire, and conquer Persia. And so he kept going. And so what happened next, Alexander then invaded into Mesopotamia, Iraq, which would eventually lead to another battle between him and Darius III. So I think that was in October of 331, called the Battle of Gaugamela, also called sometimes Arabella, which is what that little video clip was about at the beginning, about that battle. And that one right there, that second battle between Alexander and Darius, that one was, of course, considered to be the battle that would settle the whole differences between the two and the fate of Persia. And that's basically what would happen. I do have a map showing you the battlefield with this one, which is right here. The Persians had a huge army, at least according to some of these Greek writers like Arrian and I think Curtius Rufus talk about the fact that Alexander's forces were outnumbered like 5 to 1. I think like 250,000 men, kind of like Xerxes, in the Battle of Thermopylae. If that's really true, I don't know. Maybe it was a huge army, I do know, but they're not really sure how big it was, really. And what Alexander did in this battle, he kind of relied on some tactics to defeat Darius's forces. And one of the things he did was he tried to stretch out Darius's forces, especially on his left flank and his cavalry. And he acted like he was going to attack his left flank, like he did at Issus. Actually, Darius thought he was going to do that too, as well. But you know what happened in the battle? Alexander did this totally 90-degree turn with his cavalry. And then what happened was he struck at that gap that it kind of formed in the middle there. And he attacked with his companion cavalry, which I told you, that whole sword and shield thing we talked about. And so That caused, when he attacked that Darius's center there where that gap was, what happened was Darius, fearing that he was going to get captured again, like at Issus, fled again. He took off running, basically. And later it causes the Persian army to collapse, although at one point some of the Persians broke through, but they were able to stop them. And so basically that battle was considered to be really Alexander's greatest battle he fought. And then from there, because he defeated Darius, he then marched onward to take over Iran by the year 330 BC, which is, the capital and heart of the Persian Empire in southern Iran. And so he captures that, and that pretty much is the bulk of the conquest that Alexander does, which he'll continue in the east later. And I've talked about this before, about Persepolis, which Persepolis, I told you before, was this great city that had been built by the Persians, like going back to King Darius the Great. And of course, what happened was Alexander, if you know about it, burned it down. He destroyed it. And suppose he burned it because he was kind of getting revenge for the Persians sacking the Greek cities, like, of course, Athens. So that was the reason why he did it, for that purpose. He could have used it as a capital, he was forming this empire, but I don't know why he just burned it down. It's kind of crazy about that. Now, he's 25. So Alexander pretty much, when he finishes off pretty much the bulk of the Persian Empire, he conquers it, but he keeps going. If you know about this, Alexander keeps going and he pushes eastward, taking over Afghanistan, taking over Pakistan, and then pushing into northern India where the Indus River Valley was. And you have to understand that the Persian Empire was as large to the west as it was to the east. In fact, the one in the east was kind of like the old Persian Empire from a long time ago. And if you go to that map I showed you earlier, which is right here, you can see where he went. So he went down here, conquered some of the old cities, Persepolis, Pasargadae, were here, of course, as well. That was the old capital of Persia. Ecbatana, another famous city, of course, in northern Iran. Then he pushed eastward into Parthia. He actually found Darius III here, dead. He had been killed by his own men, who kind of, I guess, were sick of him. He later had him buried. It was kind of nice of him. And then, of course, he pushed into Afghanistan, like I said, and then into India. And they believe that Alexander descended into India via the Hindu Kush Mountains. So he came through there, likely through the Khyber Pass, which is that 30-something mile pass that runs between the Hindu Kush Mountains around where Afghanistan to Pakistan is. And so that basically is how he gets into India. And he descends, you can see, down into the Indus River Valley where the Punjab region of India is, which is in northern India, part of Pakistan, right where it says Nicaea in that map. It's a city founded there in that region. Now, what happens next, there was actually one more battle that Alexander would fight in, they think, the year 326 BC. It's called the Battle of the Hydaspes, or sometimes called River Hydaspes. It's called different names. They also call it Jhelum as well. Jhelum. And so basically descends, there's the other name, Jhelum, Jhelum. And happened, they think, in May of 326. And he fought against this general, actually a king in general, named Porus. Porus was some kind of Raja who lived in the Punjab region of northern India. He had, like, Alexander marched through there trying to conquer it. So he decided to challenge his forces. And so he had about 30,000 troops, they think, with cavalry. And then he also had elephants with him, like I think about 80 elephants or so, I think he had. And so he challenged him where the river Hydaspes is, which the Hydaspes was a tributary of the Indus River in the Punjab region, basically. like it said here, it was the monsoon season was starting to start about that time. So it starts about May or whatever. And so really bad rainy conditions and all that. The river was practically flooding. The two armies were facing each other, across this river. And one of the things that Alexander does, which is very, very famous, he crosses the river on what is, I think, Porus's left flank and turns it, attacks the right flank of what is Porus. And it leads to eventually the Greeks winning the battle, but it was a very bloody battle because of the elephants, that the Indians had. Alexander got wounded in the battle, and then his horse was mortally wounded and died. So Bucephalus was killed in the battle, and he was so heartstrucken about the horse dying that he built a city for it. He named it after it. It was called Bucephalia. So anyway, so at that point, it looked like Alexander was just going to march on at that point. You go back to that map that I showed you, which is right here. He was just going to march on to go. We see where Nicaea is. He was going to march over the eastward and go, I guess, in the rest of India. And some people think he was going to keep marching, I guess, and try to reach the Pacific Ocean, where close to China is. But his men basically mutinied against him, and they wouldn't go on anymore. And so basically, at that point, he was forced to return. And so the old saying about Alexander was that the only people that actually beat him was his own men. In fact, it was, I think, a famous quote by, I want to say, was it John? I think it was John Milton said it. But he said, "When Alexander saw the breadth of his domain, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer." So he didn't have any more worlds to conquer. And so that made him real sad. But at that point, he had to return. His men were making him come back. So at that point, what happened was he brought his forces down to the mouth of the Indus River, where they eventually split up. And half his forces went back to Mesopotamia through the Persian Gulf via naval ships. And Alexander took the other half back through southern Persia via land. You can see it in this map here, what happens. So he comes down here, now the Indus River, and half his men goes back this way through the Persian Gulf, and then Alexander comes back this way through like southern Iran. And actually, what's interesting story about Alexander was he actually lost more men on the way back through the deserts of Iran and Persia and all that than actually all the battles he fought. So a lot of men died of disease, starvation, lack of food and water. Basically, a lot of people thought he was dead or lost. I don't know. I think people kind of wondered where he was going to come back, in the West. And so he does come back, 324 BC. Alexander eventually returns to Babylon. And Babylon was going to be Alexander's empire's capital that he was forming at that point. But they believe a few months, maybe 6 months or so after Alexander came back, he grew ill. They think in the summer of 323. They think he died, they think maybe in the month of June at the age of 32. Now, of course, there's been a lot of speculation about what killed Alexander. There's all kinds of theories about that exist today. And of course, the two most popular theories about what happened to Alexander was that he got some kind of illness when he was in the East, likely from a mosquito bite. They think it's either malaria or some kind of like typhoid fever. So that could have been what killed him, they think, because I think they say he was sick for a week or so and kind of going in and out of comas until eventually he succumbed to whatever it was. Of course, the other theory they had, of course, it's popular as well, was that he was poisoned, which means assassination. His own mother, by the way, Queen Olympias, thought he was poisoned. So he could have been poisoned, but I think illness is more popular, I think, than the other one. After his death, of course, what happened was his generals began fighting for control of his empire. Because Alexander didn't really have a son. If you know about this, back when he was on his deathbed, the generals kept asking him, Who should we give the throne to? You know what he kept saying? He kept saying, give it to the strongest. It should go to the strongest. So what happened was after he died, his generals, by about 322 BC, started fighting over it. And it led to a series of kind of like civil wars between his generals that was called the Wars of the Diadochi, which Diadochi means in Greek successor. So wars, the successors, or successor wars is what it meant. And so for around 20 years or so, they basically fought over the whole thing is what occurred. And eventually what happened was they broke it up into these different states that formed afterwards. They were called either Hellenistic kingdoms or Hellenistic states, if you want to call it that. And the first one that was famous, if you know about it, was the Ptolemaic kingdom. That one was founded by the general Ptolemy, later called Ptolemy I or Ptolemy I Soter. I think Soter was a nickname. Anyway, that particular state was where that yellow area is. Of course, where Egypt is, be the so-called Ptolemaic kingdom. The Ptolemaic kingdom will be around for like 3 centuries, from like the 4th century, close to actually from like about 300 to about maybe close to about 30 BC. So it's around for like 200-300 years. Right there. It rules over like mostly Egypt, part of Libya. Not know if it ruled over Sudan or not, maybe part of it, but mostly Egypt and part of Libya. That's where it was. If you see that area, kind of like teal green area, that's real big. That was the Seleucid Empire, which was another state that formed, another Hellenistic state. And it was based in Iran and Iraq, with also being part of Syria as well. It was founded by a general named Seleucus, later called Seleucus I. So it got named after him. It was called the Seleucid Empire. That one was the largest, and it would last until like maybe Roman times, but the Romans would later destroy it. Then, of course, they had another one, which was in that pink area in the middle, called the Antigonus dynasty and state. It was founded by this another general named Antigonus I, sometimes called Antigonus the One-Eyed. But his collapsed. His like lasted only to like 301 BC. He died in battle fighting against them at what is called Ipsus in Turkey. That one broke up and it was kind of taken over by the Seleucids and also the Lysimachian state as well, which is in that purple area up top where Thrace is, next to the Black Sea. Also in that kind of really bright green area where it says Cassandros, that was the kingdom of Macedonia. It broke away and continued as a state afterwards. It was basically mostly founded and ruled and continued afterwards by Antipater and his son Cassander or Cassandros, who were also generals under Alexander as well. So kind of talking about all these different states that they have there that they form. So his empire never got back together. But I'll get to it in a second, but they do influence the region, of course, quite a lot. And one thing that happens, of course, because of Alexander's, conquests in the East, is that it creates a new historical period at that time that was called the Hellenistic Age or Hellenistic Period, called either one, which lasts about around 300 years from the late 4th century to the late 1st century. So 323 to about close to 30 BC, I guess, would be the time period of when it usually exists. And it's like it says, it's an extension of Greek. It's an extension of the Greek period. Yes, it is. But it's an extension of the Greek culture, really, where Greek culture was basically spread throughout the whole Near East, into Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and even spread all the way to India. And so it had a lot of influences on a lot of people, everywhere. So it brought in the Greek religion, the Greek language, Greek types of culture, drama, architecture, philosophy, history. So all that kind of affected the region more or less over time. And what's going to happen later is that most of these states that you're looking at are going to be conquered. Like a good bit of them are, especially the ones up to like Iraq. And you'll see later the Roman Empire is going to come in, and it's going to basically take over most of those regions we're talking. It mostly destroys most of those empires that you're looking at, which the last one that was destroyed, of course, was the Ptolemaic kingdom, which pretty much was ended by 30 BC with Queen Cleopatra killing herself. And Octavian would take it over, who would later be the first emperor of the Romans, Augustus. So the Romans were heavily influenced by Hellenistic culture, Greek culture, and they would adopt a lot of their ideas, which I'll, of course, be kind of talking about later, more or less. So that's it. Of course, for talking about, of course, the rise of Macedonia and, of course, the Hellenistic age. Before I go, I do want to, of course, review a little bit on what we've covered pretty much on this period, because I need to kind of do that, and that's pretty much it, what I'll do. Then, of course, next week we'll be, of course, getting into and talking about the Roman state, history of Rome, and later the Roman Republic and Empire. So who were the Macedonians? Where did they develop? The Macedonians were Greek peoples that lived in the northern part of Greece, in what is now, of course, later called Macedonian Greece. They formed a state called Macedon or Macedonia, which, of course, became a kingdom, later an empire. Who was Philip II? What was he famous for? Philip II was a 4th century Macedonian ruler who was the father of Alexander the Great, and he was the one that developed their military and made them really into a main power in Greece. What was the Macedonians' military's main centerpiece of its armies? Well, they had two things. They had the foot companions, which was like the infantry, which used these 18-foot pikes. They were called a sarissa, and so they're often called Macedonian pike forces, or pike phalanx. Also, they had the companion cavalry, which was, of course, their offensive weapon that they used in battle, usually on their flanks. They would use these to attack the enemy's flanks. They usually led, of course, later by Alexander the Great. Queen Olympias was the main, of course, wife of Philip II, and of course, she was also the mother of Alexander the Great. What allowed Alexander the Great to seize power in 336 BC? His real name was, of course, Alexander III. His father was assassinated, and so that allowed Alexander to take power. What are some interesting facts about Alexander? I told you that Alexander was educated by Aristotle. We had a school there. He was also famous for his horse, Bucephalus, which he rode across Asia as he conquered it. I think I mentioned about his friend Ephesian. I don't know if that's important, but he had this friend Ephesian that he grew up with, that he was very close with. What ancient historical works and authors are the main source of Alexander's life? The ones I want you to know, or at least the three main ones I want you to know. I wouldn't worry about Diodorus of Sicily, but Plutarch wrote the life of Alexander. That's, of course, one of the best ones. Arrian of Nicomedia wrote the campaigns of Alexander, also called the Anabasis Alexander. Also, Curtius Rufus, of course, wrote the history of Alexander the Great. What empire did Alexander begin conquering in 334 BC? It was a rule that he later went on to defeat by 330 BC. He defeated the Persian Empire, which, of course, they called the Greek name Achaemenid. Of course, the king he fought and defeated was King Darius or Darius III. What major battle fought near Syria allowed Alexander force to conquer Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, all that, Israel? That was the Battle of Issus that he fought in 330 BC. What famous city did Alexander found in Egypt? Alexandria, on the northern coast. What great battle fought in Iraq was Alexander's greatest military victory? He destroyed an army 5 times his size, fighting against Darius III. That was, of course, the Battle of Gaugamela, also called Arbela. How old was Alexander when he defeated the Persians? At least Darius the Great, Darius III, we're talking about. He was about 25. From there, he conquered the rest of the empire that was in the east. He took over Afghanistan. He took over Pakistan, and he pushed into northern India. What Indian king tried to stop Alexander's invasion in northern India? That was the king Porus, who was a Raja in the Punjab region of northern India. What was the name of the battle? It was called the Battle of Hydaspes, or River Hydaspes. So I think there's an Indian name now called Jhelum. What military innovation did the Greek force of Alexander encounter when he was attacked? They fought elephants, which they'd never really done before. I think Persia had some, but they were used for pack animals. What forced Alexander to return to Iraq around 326 BC? His men mutinied. They quit on him, and he was forced to go back. What likely caused Alexander's death in 323 BC at Babylon? They think he died of an illness, which they think maybe malaria is popular, typhoid fever maybe. And then, of course, they think also that maybe it could have been poison, but they're not sure about that one as much. What was the result of Alexander dying? His generals eventually broke up his empire, and they fought for control of it. It led to a civil war between his generals, which was called the Wars of the Diadachi, or the Diadachi Wars, or Successor Wars, which last for about 20 years or so. What historical period followed? Why is it called this? It was called the Hellenistic Age or Hellenistic Period, and it's called that because of the fact that because of Alexander's conquests, the Greeks were able to spread their culture all throughout the Near East and influence that whole region. In Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, all of it was affected, of course, by Greek influences, including the Romans, who, of course, came into that region as well. What were some Macedonian Hellenistic states that emerged afterwards? Who were their founders? I'll tell you the most famous one was the Ptolemaic Kingdom, which was founded in Egypt. That was founded by Ptolemy I, also known as Ptolemy Soter, or Ptolemy I Soter. Also, Seleucus, one of Alexander's general, founded the Seleucid Empire as well. Also, I told you there was another general named Antigonus. He founded a state in what is Turkey called the Antigonus Kingdom, I guess, but it collapsed. And then also I told you about Antipater and Cassander. They basically broke the Macedonian state off and continued afterwards as a separate state. But a lot of those states later, like I said, were all conquered by the Romans in the future, especially by the first centuries, more or less. So anyway, that's pretty much it lecture-wise on the rise of Macedonia, of course, in the Hellenistic age. Pretty much I'm not going to start on the Roman Empire. I probably could today, but I'm going to pretty much stop here because this is where the second exam, of course, material is going to stop at this point. So basically starting later, I think this afternoon, you can go ahead and start working on it. But I told you that the second exam will not be due until, I'll give you up to like Monday, I think, not next week, but the week after, November 16th. So it's going to be up a while. But most of you are probably still working on those other assignments right now. So don't forget, you got the first exam that's kind of still up right now that you have. It's going to expire tonight. So if you want to do that one, if you haven't done it, you need to do it, of course. Otherwise, you're going to get behind. And then don't forget, I did put up a new assignment a couple of days ago. I think on Wednesday I thought. One of those days I did, which is the Canvas quiz on India. So that's up too also as well. So I am going to have this lecture up, of course, on my YouTube channel afterwards. So if you got any comments, questions, let me know, of course, about this lecture. That's about it for this lecture this week. So if you got any comments, questions, let me know, whatever you got out there. And that's about it. So y'all take care and y'all have a good weekend coming up. So see you later.